Hey guys, tonight we slip onto the creaking deck of a pirate ship, sails snapping above you in the warm Caribbean wind, ropes groaning as though the whole vessel is breathing with you. Lanterns sway, throwing uneven shadows across the planks, and somewhere below, a drunk sailor sings off-key about a lover he left ashore. The night air tastes of salt and rum, and though the adventure feels thrilling, you probably won't survive this. Between storms, disease, and the dangerous boredom that creeps in when there's nothing to fight but your own loneliness. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing this little global crew gathering.
Oh, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.
You slide into the hammock, ropes creaking as the ship rocks, and immediately notice how cramped it feels. The canvas digs into your back, and the sailor next to you snores like he's strangling a goat.
Welcome to pirate life.
Unlike the flashy stories in Hollywood, most of your nights are less about treasure and more about tossing around restlessly in swaying fabric, trying to forget the ache of being utterly alone. The sea is vast, the stars are infinite, but the human body has a way of reminding you that you're very much a creature of needs, and most of those aren't being met out here.
The loneliness is its own storm. On land, you might have sweethearts, wives, or quick dalliances in taverns. But at sea? It's weeks, sometimes months, of nothing but men and the sound of waves slapping against wood. Historical records confirm that voyages could stretch across oceans for 3, 4, even 6 months without sight of land. That meant no women, no intimacy, no familiar warmth, just hammocks hung inches apart, each sailor clutching his blanket like it might hug him back. And here's a quirky tidbit: hammocks weren't just for sleep, they doubled as coffins. If a man died on board, he was sewn into his hammock with the last stitch through his nose, just to make sure he wasn't merely passed out drunk. Imagine lying awake, trying not to think about that, while also trying to keep your mind off the other gnawing hunger that nobody dared to voice too loudly. Historians still argue whether pirates were more disciplined than we imagine or more reckless than official records let on. Some argue that the lack of female company actually reinforced a kind of macho pride, men convincing themselves that denying desire proved toughness. Others suggest that repression only pushed those longings into jokes, rituals, or unspoken arrangements. Either way, the silence was thick. The only thing louder than the ocean was the unacknowledged craving. You roll over in the hammock, pulling the zinc blanket up. Every sound is exaggerated in the night: the groan of the ship's timbers, the slap of waves, the hiss of the wind slipping through rigging. Even the rats scurrying for crumbs seem to taunt you. A sailor nearby mutters a prayer, another scratches at a rash that you suspect isn't from mosquito bites. The ship smells of sweat, tar, salt, and faint desperation. It wasn't all repression, of course. Pirates told bawdy stories to pass time, sometimes carving obscene little drawings on the wood. Archaeologists have even found crude graffiti on old ships, the 17th century version of bathroom stall scribbles. The humor gave release to what couldn't be spoken directly. A joke about the goat left behind in port, a bawdy shanty about a tavern maid's apron, a knowing wink when a hammock rocked a little too much. But in the long stretches between ports, all that was mostly distraction. The truth pressed in heavier at night. Sailors would sometimes press their faces into the canvas of the hammock just to feel something against their skin. Others wrote letters to imagined sweethearts, though they knew the parchment might never reach land. Loneliness became the unwelcome bunkmate, curling up beside you tighter than the blanket. A mainstream historical fact here: the average pirate ship carried crews of 80 to 200 men crammed into tight quarters. Privacy was non-existent. Your hammock might be so close to another man's that you could feel his breath as he turned. This lack of space heightened the tension. You were always seen, always overheard. And so, the longing had to coil itself inward, gnawing quietly. Still, you find yourself laughing sometimes. Pirates wären allweis grimm.
One sailor might tell the same dirty limerick night after night, and it somehow got funnier, maybe because it was the only fresh entertainment. Someone else might put a crab in a fellow's hammock as a prank, which seems funny until it clamps onto your toe. And in those moments, the whole ship laughed together, the ache of absence masked for a few minutes. But as the laughter fades and the night deepens, the silence grows heavier. The sea stretches endlessly, mocking you with its beauty. Stars shine like sparks spilled across velvet, each one out of reach. You listen to the whisper of waves and wonder how many men before you lay here with the same restless desire, counting stars instead of kisses, breathing salt instead of perfume.
There's another odd detail. Some sailors swore that the rocking of the hammock itself was soothing enough to mimic a kind of comfort. They'd sway back and forth, eyes closed, pretending they were being held. Was it sad? Maybe. Was it survival? Definitely. Out here, imagination was the only luxury that didn't run out.
Historians still debate whether this enforced abstinence made pirates harsher in battle. Some argue that the bottled-up frustration made them more reckless when violence offered release. Others think the opposite, that long deprivation made men cling harder to comradeship, fighting to protect the only closeness they could rely on, the brotherhood of the crew. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. You feel it tonight, lying in your swaying hammock. The storm outside hasn't broken yet, but the one inside is harder to calm. The ship is full of men, yet loneliness is the loudest presence aboard. And as you drift toward uneasy sleep, you realize that the greatest treasure promised by port isn't gold or rum. It's simply the possibility of touch, waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. You wake to the sound of gulls, which is strange because you're still days from land. It takes you a moment to realize it's just a sailor imitating them to tease the half-asleep crew. The sun's already beating down, sails creak overhead, and the deck is buzzing with movement. You swing down from your hammock and notice something. There are no women here. None at all. Not in the rigging, not in the galley, not even in the shadows of the hold. Just men, everywhere, sunburnt and unshaven, with voices roughened by salt and smoke. This absence wasn't by accident. Sailors and pirates alike carried an old superstition: women on ships brought bad luck. Not just oops we missed the wind bad luck, but full-on storms, mutinies, wrecks, the sea gods themselves rising in anger. In their minds, a woman's presence distracted men from their duty, and distraction at sea could mean disaster. You already know how fragile life on these wooden tubs could be. Every rope mattered, every bucket of water mattered. And so, women were kept ashore, or at least that was the official line. Still, you can feel the irony, right? A crew full of men, restless and deprived, swearing that the very thing they craved most was too dangerous to bring aboard. Historians still argue whether this superstition was truly believed or just an excuse for strict control. Some suggest captains used it as a way to keep discipline. Better to cloak a rule in divine fear than admit it was about managing testosterone. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some cultures, fishermen carved female figures onto their ship's prows, the famous figureheads. These were meant to calm the sea or guide the vessel, like symbolic guardians. A woman's body was banned in the flesh but invited as carved wood. The hypocrisy is almost comical, imagining a ship pitched in storms while sailors prayed to a wooden mermaid nailed to the bow. You walk the deck now, sun glaring off the water, and you feel the pressure of this ban. It wasn't only about superstition. Ships were fragile communities, and desire was dangerous fuel. A single woman aboard could spark rivalry, jealousy, even violence. Better, the captains thought, to erase temptation altogether than to risk duels with cutlasses over a smile. And yet, the craving didn't vanish just because the women were gone. Instead, it seeped into the cracks of conversation. A sailor might sigh over a lost sweetheart while splicing rope, or hum a tune about a tavern girl while scrubbing the deck. Even the food became a metaphor. Jokes about melons, bananas, coconuts passed from hand to hand with knowing smirks. You can't help but chuckle, because if you were stuck on a ship for months with no outlet, you'd probably turn the daily rations into punchlines too. The prohibition also shaped how pirates moved on land. When ships finally reached port, crews spilled ashore like floodwaters, rushing into taverns and brothels as though trying to make up for every lonely hammock. That mad rush was a direct result of the long, no women aboard superstition. Imagine shaking a bottle of rum for months and then finally popping the cork. The explosion was messy, loud, and often ended in broken furniture. But let's not over-romanticize it. The absence of women wasn't just inconvenient for sailors, it also erased women from much of the written record of piracy. Except for rare figures like Anne Bonny or Mary Red, the story is overwhelmingly male. You can almost hear the silence of those who never even got a chance to stand on deck, silenced not by waves but by superstition itself. Still, there were cracks in the rule. Some captains bent it, usually for wealthy passengers who insisted on bringing wives or daughters along, and, occasionally, women disguised themselves as men to sneak aboard. There are tales of discovery when a young sailor who never shaved was found to be something else entirely. Whether those tales are exaggerated or true, they point to the fact that desire and curiosity always found ways to slip through rules.
You notice toho the absence capete de cruz humor.
The bawdiest jokes often centered on this very gap, men laughing at the irony of being surrounded by waves and ropes but having none of the softness they longed for. Pirates weren't known for subtlety, and their jokes usually involved loud innuendo shouted across the deck. Imagine someone yelling, "This is the only mistress who never says no," and the whole crew laughing, not because it's clever, but because it stings with truth. A mainstream fact, many naval codes explicitly banned women on board. The French Navy in the 17th century wrote it straight into their regulations, and the Royal Navy discouraged it with equal force. Pirates, though technically free from such codes, often copied the rule. Why? Because pirates were deserters, former naval men, or merchant sailors who carried the same habits.
The sea was conservative even when the men weren't.
And yet, some sailors whispered that the real reason had nothing to do with storms or jealousy. Instead, women represented the shore, home, family, stability. To bring one aboard would remind the men of everything they'd left behind. Better, perhaps, to keep the wound clean and to salt it with reminders. Historians still debate this angle, but it adds a layer of melancholy to the superstition. Maybe the ban was less about fear of storms and more about fear of heartbreak.
You lean on the railing, staring at the endless horizon. The waves shimmer like glass and the Zen is merciless.
You think about how silence multiplies when there's no outlet, how the absence of women created not just frustration but also a strange solidarity. Men laughed together, worked together, fought together, and pretended they didn't feel the gap. But in the quiet hours, you know they did.
Über Nacht wen hammocks zwei und Starsborn bricht die Superstition lingers in Jahr mindestens.
Was it true? Could a woman's presence really summon a storm? Or was it simply another human way of controlling what we fear most, our own desires? Whatever the answer, you lie back, listening to the ocean's whisper, and realize the real storm was never out there. It was always inside the ship, inside the men, inside the aching quiet where women were forbidden to step. The ship finally limps into port, sails flapping, hull groaning like a tired beast. You can feel the energy change instantly. For weeks you've been trapped in a world of waves and wood, nothing but the creak of rigging and the stink of men. But now the horizon bristles with rooftops, church steeples, and a promise of something far more intoxicating than fresh water or new supplies. The crew can practically taste it.
Brothels and taverns wait just beyond the docks, glowing in imagination like treasure chests left carelessly open.
The rush ashore is almost comical. Pirates tumble down gangplanks, boots clattering, already half drunk from anticipation. Rum barrels roll out, but most men don't even pause for a sip. They head straight for the red lanterns or the crooked wooden signs swinging above tavern doors. Inside, the air is heavy with smoke, perfume, and sweat. You're shoved into a room full of noise, fiddles sawing out jigs, tankards slamming against tables, and voices roaring as though everyone is trying to drown out the loneliness that's been gnawing at them for months. Here, in the brothels of Nassau, Port Royal, or Tortuga, pirates found the release that the sea denied them. Historical records describe these ports as nurseries of vice, buzzing with establishments that catered to sailors' hunger for drink and flesh. Prostitutes paraded the taverns openly, dressed in gaudy colors, calling out to sailors with laughter that promised warmth after endless cold nights at sea. You can almost smell the mix: cheap perfume, stale beer, frying meat, and the salt still clinging to the men's clothes. But this wasn't just indulgence, it was ritual. After months of restraint, pirates threw themselves into these spaces with desperation. A sailor might spend half his pay in one night, gambling, drinking, and hiring companionship. You see him stumble upstairs, arm in arm with a woman whose smile looks practiced but not unfriendly. For that one night, the hammock's loneliness is replaced with human touch. A quirky tidbit. Some brothels kept menus painted on the wall, listing not meals but services, sometimes with illustrations. Imagine squinting at crude artwork by candlelight, trying to decide whether to spend your silver on ale, cards, or a half hour with someone in lace. The humor is both bawdy and bleak. You realize these men lived like lottery winners who knew they'd be broke by sunrise. Historians still argue whether pirates were reckless fools with their money or calculated spenders who saw brothel visits as necessary morale boosters. One camp insists that the wild spending was proof of their undisciplined nature. Gold vanished as quickly as it came. Another side suggests that pirates, knowing they lived short lives, consciously chose pleasure over savings.
Why hoard coins if you could be hanged tomorrow?
We've trug the kraut, felling the flosticky benny at your boats. A fiddler leans into his tune while two men wrestle near the hearth, laughing even as their fists land. Above you hear the thump of boots on creaky stairs and the muffled sounds behind thin walls. It's not subtle, but then again, nothing about pirates ever was. Not everyone joined the chaos. Some sailors slipped into quiet corners with a single drink, content just to sit near the laughter and watch others indulge. Others wrote clumsy letters to women in distant towns, tucking them into pockets they knew would never see a post. Desire didn't always demand satisfaction. Sometimes being surrounded by life was enough to break the silence of the sea. Of course, there was a darker side. Disease spread quickly in these crowded ports, syphilis being the most notorious. Pirates joked about it, nicknaming the illness the pox's kiss, but the reality was brutal.
Mut ulkas rasches even madness.
You watch a sailor scratch at sores under his shirt, pretending not to notice as his shipmate laughs too loudly. The price of indulgence was often more than just coin.
But tonight, none of that matters. The room is a carnival of distraction. A woman balances a tree of mocks, hips swaying, earrings flashing in the candlelight.
She leans down, whispers something into a pirate's ear, and he roars with laughter, slapping the table until his rum spills. You can't hear what she said, but you can guess it was probably something that sounded sweeter than the sea ever could. This chaos wasn't unique to pirates. Merchant sailors, soldiers, and whalers all stormed brothels after long voyages. But pirates, with their ill-gotten gains and lack of steady employers, were notorious for taking it to extremes. In Nassau, taverns openly encouraged them because the pirates' money fueled the local economy. If your job was keeping a port alive, you wanted those silver coins clinking on your counters, no matter how they were earned. There's humor in the repetition too. Every voyage ended the same way: hunger, port, explosion of indulgence, then back to sea again. Like schoolboys on holiday, the pirates never seemed to learn. You picture one pirate swearing to himself, "This time I'll save my gold." Cut to a week later, he's staggering back to the ship penniless, hungover, and grinning, because the promise of restraint was never the point. Another detail worth savoring: many pirates formed regular connections with specific brothels or women. These weren't just anonymous encounters. Some sailors had a favorite, someone they sought out each time they returned. The relationship might have been transactional, but familiarity offered its own kind of comfort. A smile remembered, a shared joke, a repeated ritual of meeting again. It was intimacy, however fragile. Historians still debate whether these relationships softened pirates or hardened them further. Did the fleeting touch of companionship remind them of what they lacked, or did it refresh them enough to face the sea again? Some argue it was a double-edged sword: relief today, emptiness tomorrow.
You, standing in the noisy tavern, can't feel both sides pressing in. The night wears on.
Tankards empty and refill, laughter rises and falls, and the fiddler finally breaks a string. Men stumble upstairs two at a time, while others pass out on benches, faces sticky with ale. You step outside into the cool night air, and even the streets hum with energy. Shadows move in alleyways, deals are struck, coins exchange hands.
The brothels are full, the taverns overflowing, and the town pulses like a heart beating just for the pirates' return.
And yet, as you lean against the wall and look at the dark sea beyond the docks, you realize how temporary it all is.
In a few days, the ship will pull away again. The hammocks will swing, the loneliness will return, and the memory of this night will become one more story to joke about on deck. For now, though, the brothel's glow feels like salvation, however fleeting. The pirates drink, laugh, and love as though tomorrow doesn't exist, because for them it really might not. The sun rises slowly over the port, painting the water with streaks of gold, and the streets smell of last night's rum and wood smoke. You walk among pirates who stagger like soldiers after a battle, not wounded, just exhausted from laughter, drink, and excess. Yet not every pirate rushes to the brothels with a fistful of coins and a belly full of bravado. Some search for something a little steadier, something that lasts longer than a single night behind a thin door. This is where you hear the phrase whispered among sailors, "a wife of the port." You pass along the crooked alleys, past market stalls where women sell fruit and fish with voices as sharp as the knives they use to cut them. Pirates hover here not just to barter for food, but to catch the eye of a woman who might become more than a fleeting distraction. A wife of the port wasn't usually a legal wife, no priest, no church bells. She was the woman a pirate chose to visit again and again whenever his ship dropped anchor. Sometimes she worked in a tavern, sometimes in a brothel, and sometimes she was simply a local woman willing to tie herself loosely to a man who might vanish for months. The arrangement offered comfort. Imagine stumbling off a ship after weeks at sea, skin blistered from the sun, clothes stiff with salt. Instead of searching for strangers in a crowded brothel, you knew exactly whose door to knock on, whose face would greet you with a mix of relief and resignation. For a pirate, it was the closest thing to stability. For the women, it was often survival, a reliable source of money or goods in towns where coin was scarce and danger was constant.
One mainstream historical fact, in places like Port Royal in Jamaica or Tortuga off Hispaniola, these relationships were so common that colonial officials wrote reports about them. Governors complained that pirates drained their riches on local women, leaving nothing to invest in trade or property. The irony, of course, was that this spending propped up the port economy.
Pirates didn't buy land, but they bought meals, drinks, favors, and even gifts like imported cloth.
Here's a quirky tidbit. Some pirates brought back small trinkets from their voyages to give these wives. Buttons from French uniforms, bits of silver plate, or even exotic feathers, anything that looked flashy enough to impress. It wasn't exactly romantic jewelry from a fine shop, but when a pirate placed a carved shell necklace around a woman's throat, it meant something. A gesture that, for however long he was ashore, he belonged to her. Historians still argue whether these semi-permanent bonds represented genuine affection or were purely transactional. Were pirates capable of love, or were they too hardened by the sea? Some letters suggest tenderness, scribbled notes promising return, or mentions in wills of money left to a particular woman. Others point out that the system left women vulnerable, dependent on men who might never come back. Perhaps the truth lived in the in-between, affection mixed with necessity, longing mingled with bargain.
Use it on a stop now, watching a scene play out.
A pirate, hair matted from weeks at sea, approaches a woman carrying a basket of oranges. She pretends not to see him at first, then allows herself a smile as he presses something into her hand, a coin maybe, or a token from his latest plunder. She nods, and together they walk down the street. No words spoken loudly, no grand gestures.
Just a quiet agreement renewed for another visit.
The humor in these arrangements wasn't lost on the crew. Other pirates teased each other mercilessly about their marriages. If a man spent too much time with his port wife, he might return to the ship with mock cheers, "Congratulations, Captain Husband." The laughter masked envy, of course. Not everyone had someone waiting. Some only had the brothel, while others had nothing but their hammock and a memory. There's another layer here, the rivalry between pirates and soldiers or merchants for the same women. Imagine a garrison of redcoats stationed in town, glaring at pirates swaggering into taverns and claiming attention with jingling purses. Local women often preferred the pirates because pirates spent freely, lived wildly, and didn't demand obedience in the same way soldiers did. For all their reputation as criminals, pirates sometimes offered more equality in their partnerships. At least until the ship sailed away again. You stroll into a tavern where a woman sits with a pirate, laughing softly at something he says. She wears a ribbon in her hair, maybe a gift from him, maybe one she saved for moments like this. The pirate touches her hand, and for a second you glimpse something rare, tenderness. It almost looks like a couple anywhere else in the world until you remember the pistols on his belt and the knowledge that he might vanish tomorrow in smoke and cannon fire. A mainstream fact that slips into this moment: pirates rarely lived long lives. The average age of capture or death was under 35, which means many of these women likely saw more endings than beginnings. And yet they still formed these bonds. Why? Perhaps because humans will always seek connection, no matter how fragile.
Another quirky detail.
Some pirates, when flush with coin, bought their port wives not just gifts but entire houses. Small shacks really, lean-tos built from salvaged wood and palm leaves, but for a woman in a crowded port, a roof of her own was worth more than gold. Imagine the laughter of neighbors when a woman pointed proudly and said, "My pirate bought me that wall." Historians still debate whether these port wives influenced pirate behavior. Did the thought of someone waiting ashore make a man fight harder, or did it distract him? Some suggest that pirates with such bonds were less likely to mutiny because they had something to lose. Others argue the opposite, that longing for a woman only made a pirate more reckless, desperate to get back alive.
The truth again is slippery as the sea.
You wander through the market one last time before returning to the ship. The air is thick with roasting meat and spice, but also with the quiet knowledge that many of these women will soon be left behind again. Some wave as the pirates march back, some don't bother, knowing the ship might never return. For a few, the bond will last years, even decades. For most, it will fade like footprints in sand.
And yet, as the ship's anchor creaks upward and sails catch the wind, you can't help but picture the women waiting at the docks, ribbons in their hair, eyes scanning the horizon. For every pirate's loneliness at sea, there was another kind of loneliness ashore, the waiting, the wondering, the empty nights filled with the hope of hearing boots on the doorstep again.
A sea stretches out again, endless and glittering, but this time your thoughts drift what sailors never spoke of directly, the quiet question of what men did when there were no women at all.
After all, months at sea demanded more than discipline and rum. You can feel it in the air, an unspoken tension, the kind that no bawdy song or dirty joke could fully hide.
This is where you bump into one of the most controversial topics in pirate history, sodomy at sea. The word itself carried weight. In the 17th and 18th centuries, sodomy wasn't just a sin, it was a capital crime, punishable by death in most naval codes. Official records thundered about it with righteous language, and courts-martial sometimes sentenced men to hang for it. The Royal Navy was particularly harsh, making public examples out of sailors accused of unnatural acts. But then you look at pirate ships, those floating communities outside the law, and you can't help but wonder, did they enforce the same rules, or did they quietly ignore them? Historians still argue whether sodomy among pirates was common, rare, or mostly exaggerated by enemies who wanted to slander them. Some scholars insist it must have been frequent. After all, you take a few hundred young men, trap them on a wooden box for months, remove all women, and, well, biology doesn't just stop for rules. Others argue that the severe punishments and religious fear kept most men from acting on their urges. The debate rages on, and the truth likely falls somewhere between silence and survival. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some sailors joked about goats being smuggled on board, not just for milk but for company. It sounds ridiculous, half cruel, half cartoonish, but the joke was so common it became part of sea folklore. Whether anyone truly practiced it or whether it was just gallows humor, the very existence of the joke tells you how aware sailors were of the void in their lives. You can almost hear a drunken pirate on night watch nudging his friend and whispering, "Better tie up your goat, mate." Cue the groans, the laughter, and the uncomfortable truth hiding underneath. You lean against the railing at dusk, watching the sky bloods rate, and imagine how the crazy repeat itself around the sea. On a pirate ship, privacy was almost non-existent, yet somehow men still found ways to carve out slivers of intimacy. Maybe it was two men sharing the same hammock a little too often, or one choosing to stand night watch with another again and again. The crew might tease, might suspect, but often looked the other way. As long as the ship ran smoothly, some things were better left unspoken. A mainstream historical fact: in 1645, the Dutch East India Company executed sailors in Batavia for sodomy, documenting the case in gruesome detail. Such events shaped the fear aboard ships, even pirate ones. Sailors knew the risks, but they also knew the ocean didn't care about human morality. Storms, scurvy, and hunger killed more men than courts did.
Against that backdrop, the urge for touch might have seemed less dangerous than starvation.
But the hypocrisy ran deep. Pirate enemies loved accusing them of sodomy as a way of branding them as not only criminals but also immoral degenerates. Pamphlets circulated in London warning that pirates were not just thieves but unnatural beasts. It was a way of turning public opinion against them, of painting them as less than men.
Yet the same society that spread those rumors filled its own brothels nightly. The irony drips as thick tar.
You picture a night on board.
Lanterns flicker, waves slap the hull, and hammocks sway in right humor. Two sailors lie close, whispering in low voice.
Are they just talking? Are they more? No one will ever write it in the logbook.
Captain's journals remain silent, the official record erased. But in the spaces between words you sense it. After all, loneliness doesn't care about law codes, and longing doesn't ask permission.
Humor softened the edges. Pirates were masters of crude jokes, often tossing accusations of sodomy as insults during arguments. One might shout, "You cuddle hammocks tighter than your mother," and laughter would erupt. The insult stung, but it was also safe cover, a way of voicing the forbidden without naming it directly.
In these floating communities, mockery could be both a shield and a release. And what about laugh? That's the tender undercurrent historians hesitate to pin down. Could men at sea fall in laugh, not just lust?
The stories are scattered like seashells half buried in sand. Some accounts hint at fierce loyalty between shipmates, bonds so strong they seemed more than brotherhood. Was it friendship magnified by danger, or something deeper? The evidence is scarce, but the possibility lingers in every whispered word lost to the wind. There's another odd fact. Spanish inquisitors sometimes interrogated sailors caught in acts of sodomy, recording their confessions with chilling detail. In one record, a sailor explained that he could not bear the months without comfort, and so turned to his shipmate. You read the words centuries later and realize nothing has changed about human need, it's just the punishments that shifted.
You lean back, listening to the sea hum against the wood.
In your mind, you try to balance the weight of law, superstition, and secrecy. Did pirates truly indulge in sodomy often, or was it the nightmare their enemies wanted the world to believe? Historians still can't agree, and maybe that's the point. The ocean kept its secrets. The waves swallowed evidence, and the silence of hammocks told stories no one dared to write. But you know this much, the absence of women left a vacuum, and nature hates a vacuum. Whether filled with laughter, rumor, whispered arrangements, or something more intimate, that space shaped the lives of every man aboard. Tonight, as the ship glides under a canopy of stars, you feel that silence pressing in.
And somewhere in the creak of a hammock and the hushed breath of sailors, the truth has half forbidden, half inevitable. The sea is calm tonight, moonlight glimmering off the water like spilled silver, and you feel the ship settle into its rhythm again. Sails breathing, waves sighing, hammocks swaying in their quiet dance. By now, you've heard the rumors, the jokes, and the whispers about how men coped with months of deprivation. But in pirate lore, there's one arrangement that stands out, something half practical and half intimate, matelote. The word comes from the French matelot, meaning sailor, and at its simplest it described a partnership between two men at sea. On paper, it was an agreement, two mates sharing their plunder, protecting each other in battle, and ensuring that if one died, the other inherited his chest of coins, weapons, or clothes. In practice, though, matelotage often went beyond economics. You can imagine two pirates leaning close, clasping hands and swearing loyalty, not just for profit, but for companionship, warmth, and perhaps something even softer in a world made of salt and iron. A mainstream historical fact, records from Caribbean colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries describe matelotage clearly, particularly in French buccaneer communities. Colonial officials scandalized, sometimes wrote disapproving reports about unnatural brotherhoods. These documents show that the system was recognized, if not respected, by those outside the pirate world.
But here's a quirky tidbit. Some matelotage partners were even nicknamed sweethearts by the crew, and while the term was used with a wink, it also revealed how familiar such bonds were. Imagine the banter, a sailor teased for cooking his partner's meal too often, or another mocked for cleaning his friend's pistol with a little too much care.
Humor coated what everyone quietly acknowledged. These partnerships gave life on board a tenderness it otherwise lacked. Historians still argue whether mateloage was primarily sexual or simply a pragmatic survival pact. Some see it as proto-marriage between men, a defined kind of union formed under necessity. Others caution that we shouldn't project modern categories onto the past, suggesting these were more like sworn brotherhoods than love affairs.
The debate sways like the hammocks themselves, back and forth, never fully at rest. You sit on deck watching two pirates share a pipe under the stars.
Their shoulders touch as they pass the stem back and forth, exhaling smoke into the night. No words, no declarations, just comfort and closeness. Tomorrow they might fight side by side, boarding an enemy ship with pistols blazing. Tonight they simply breathe together. That's mateloage in its quietest form, companionship that makes the endless ocean feel a little less wide. Of course, not every partnership was peaceful. Some ended in jealousy, betrayal, or drunken brawls. A pirate's promise might be broken when a better prospect came along or when one man squandered the shared plunder. These breakups could be ugly, and the crew often turned them into entertainment, mocking both parties like gossipy neighbors in a village square.
On a ship, nothing stayed private for long.
The structure of mateloage often extended ashore too. In ports like Tortuga, a pirate's matelot might even share his port wife, forming strange triangular households that confused colonial officials. Picture a woman cooking stew for two men who returned from the sea together, dividing not only their loot but their bed. Did it always work smoothly? Probably not. But the fact that such arrangements existed shows just how flexible pirate life could be when it came to surviving desire. You hear a story passed along by sailors. Two French buccaneers swore mateloage and lived together for years, splitting every coin and fighting as if one body. When one died, the survivor built a small cross from driftwood and placed it on the beach, visiting it each time the ship returned. Was that love? Friendship? A pact honored? The categories blur in the salt wind. Pirates weren't shy about rituals either. Some mateloage vows were sealed with shared drinks of rum, others with small tokens, rings, scarves, or even tattoos. Imagine two men etching the same design on their arms, marks that said, "Where one goes, the other follows." Tattoos were pirate passports, telling stories on skin, and shared symbols made the partnership visible to the whole crew. Humor, as always, kept things from becoming too solemn. A pirate might grin and say, "That one keeps his matelot warmer than his rum bottle."
The Laukheiter covered the truth, Tese bonds mattered.
They gave pirates a way to push back against the crushing loneliness, to create family where none existed. In a world where death could come from a cannonball tomorrow, a matelot was someone who swore to stand over your body and make sure your boots went to someone who remembered your name. Another mainstream fact, similar systems existed outside piracy. Sailors in the French Navy sometimes formed pacts of mutual inheritance, though the sexual element was usually denied or hidden. In the Caribbean, however, where laws were looser and church oversight weaker, mateloage flourished more openly among freebooters. It became part of the mythos of the buccaneers, one more thing that set them apart from the rigid discipline of European navies. And yet, mateloage also fed into slander. Enemies painted pirates as immoral, accusing them of turning the sea into a den of debauchery. Pamphlets circulated back in Europe, warning respectable citizens that pirate ships were not just violent but sodomitical brotherhoods. Were these accusations exaggerated? Almost certainly. But the existence of mateloage gave enough truth to the rumors that the stories stuck. You picture it now, hammocks swaying, whispers exchanged, coins pooled together in a chest. Two men leaning on the rail as the dawn breaks, watching the horizon side by side. Perhaps they joke, perhaps they simply stand in silence. Either way, their partnership gives shape to the endless days, turning the monotony of the voyage into something bearable.
The sea is vast, but in mateloage, pirates found a way to make it smaller.
Historians still puzzle over how widespread it was. Some claim nearly every pirate had a matlow at one time or another. Others insist it was a minority practice, inflated by scandalous gossip. But you, watching the moonlight flicker across the waves, know this much. On a ship full of hunger and heat, loyalty mixed easily with longing.
And in that mix, men forged bonds as real as any marriage on land.
So you settle into your hammock, listening to the ship creak like an old companion, and think about matlowage not as a curiosity, but as survival. Out here, every man needed someone to guard his back, his gold, and sometimes his heart. Whether history calls it friendship, love, or something in between, the truth is simple: no pirate ever really sailed alone. The night air grows warmer, thick with the smell of tar and salted rope, and you hear the ship groan as if it too shares the weight of the secrets carried on board. You've wandered through whispered jokes and matlow's vows, but now your mind turns toward the times when the sea itself could no longer contain desire, when pirates finally stepped ashore and found themselves in the arms of brothels. Ports like Port Royal in Jamaica, Nassau in the Bahamas, or Tortuga in Hispaniola weren't just places to resupply powder and dried beef, they were playgrounds. Picture the ship pulling into harbor after months of nothing but fish stew, sweat, and cramped hammocks. The crew would practically leap to the docks, stumbling half-drunk already, because the taverns were waiting and the brothels were always ready. A mainstream historical fact: Port Royal, before the earthquake of 1692 swallowed half of it, was called the wickedest city on earth. Contemporary reports said it had one tavern for every 10 residents and brothels that never closed. Pirate crews spent their shares of plunder in days, not months, and the sex trade thrived as much as the rum trade. You can almost smell the place: roasted meat on skewers sold by street vendors, cheap rum sloshing out of cracked mugs, perfume mingling with sweat and smoke. Women leaned from balconies, calling down in half-Spanish, half-English promises, while fiddlers scraped out tunes in dark corners. To a pirate starved of touch, it must have felt like stepping into another world, one where rules no longer mattered because money spoke louder than anything else. Here's a quirky tidbit: some brothels in Port Royal supposedly accepted payment not just in coin but in stolen goods. A pirate might trade a silver candlestick or a captured French hat for an hour upstairs. Imagine the mismatched collection of plundered furniture, fabrics, and trinkets that ended up in these establishments, all of it once belonging to some unlucky merchant. Historians still argue whether pirates sought brothels mainly for sex, or if the experience was just as much about the theater of it, the laughter, the performance, the chance to feel human again after months of being little more than beasts of labor and battle. Some argue it was escapism as much as pleasure, while others insist the desperation was more physical, raw need finally unleashed.
The debate lingers, fueled by the scarcity of first-hand pirate diaries.
You picture the mad rush, a dozen sailors storming into a brothel like schoolboys into a sweet shop, throwing coins, shouting for attention, arguing over who gets the prettiest girl. Upstairs the floorboards shake while below, the madam counts her profits with a grin. In some cases, pirates would book the entire house for a night, turning it into a festival of drink and noise.
By dawn, the streets were littered with discarded bottles and men snoring in the gutters, pockets turned inside out.
Of course, the darker side lurked too. Sex workers were often exploited, trapped by debt or coercion. Pirates didn't invent the trade, they just fed it with their sudden floods of gold. Some buccaneers actually married local women, pulling them out of brothels and into makeshift households, but just as often the relationships ended as soon as the plunder was gone.
For the women, pirates were both saviors and destroyers, depending on the toss of fortune. Imagine yourself stepping into one of those houses. The air is heavy with candle smoke and sweet oil. Painted walls glow in flickering light, and laughter mixes with groans from the rooms above. A pirate beside you slaps down a coin so hard it rattles the table, boasting that he'll drink enough rum to drown the Spanish Navy before the night is over.
You feel the push of bodies around you, the eager press of life after too many months of sea's monotony. Some captains, interestingly, tried to regulate these indulgences.
Henry Morgan, infamous for his raids, was known to caution his men against spending too freely in Port Royal, warning that the taverns and brothels would strip them of everything before their next voyage. Did the men listen? Not really.
There's a reason so many pirates died poor despite stealing fortunes. They knew how to spend better than they knew how to save.
Another odd fact in Tortuga, some brothels were run not by women but by ex-sailors who saw opportunity in managing the desires of their former comrades. These men often doubled as information brokers, trading secrets along with services. A pirate might wake up lighter in gold but carrying news about a rich merchant ship's next voyage.
Sex, rum, and gossip mate and it web.
Humor followed everywhere.
Picture a pirate swaggering back to the ship, pockets empty, hiccuping, and proudly declaring, "Best investment I ever made," while the quartermaster shakes his head.
Or the classic quip,
"He's so broke he'll have to pay in seashells next time."
Jokes softened the sting of poverty, but everyone knew the pattern: raid, spend, repeat.
Historians still debate whether pirates ever formed genuine long-term attachments with women from these brothels. Some evidence suggests yes, a handful of pirates tried to settle down, even buying houses in Nassau or Port Royal, living with former sex workers as wives or partners. Others dismiss it as romantic myth-making, pointing out how short and brutal pirate careers usually were. Perhaps love flickered in those smoky rooms, but the ocean always called men back.
Now, as you lean against the rail of the ship in your imagination, watching the distant lights of a port fade behind you, you realize brothels were more than just outlets. They were rituals, part of the rhythm of piracy. Plunder, celebration, indulgence, loss, it repeated in cycles as predictable as the tide.
For every hammock swaying with whispered loyalty at sea, there was a crowded room on land where coins bought a few hours of illusion.
And you can't help but smirk at the irony. Pirates feared across empires, reduced to clumsy, half-romantic customers fumbling for tenderness in perfumed rooms. It's messy, human, and somehow fitting. The sea took so much from them, and for a brief night in a brothel, they could pretend to take something back.
"The sea is never quit for long."
One night it feels like a cradle, rocking you gently, and the next it growls with storms, reminding you that comfort is always borrowed. Yet even with all the ports and brothels waiting on shore, you can't ignore what happened in the liminal spaces in between, the blurred lines of companionship that turned into physical intimacy on board. This is where you wander into the delicate subject of same-sex bonds, not formalized like mateloage, not transactional like brothels, but born of the grind of daily survival.
You're in the belly of the ship, lantern swinging, wood creaking.
Men sleep in hammocks, side by side, so close their elbows touch when they roll over. Privacy is a fantasy.
You share everything, food, water, sweet secrets.
And in that closeness, sometimes the line between camaraderie and something more simply dissolves. A mainstream historical fact, in the early 18th century, the Royal Navy's Articles of War listed sodomy as a crime punishable by death, and several sailors were executed after being accused, even without full evidence. This official harshness makes the silence in pirate records suspicious. Did pirates enforce the same law? Or did their looser codes leave room for something different? Historians still argue whether the absence of prosecutions on pirate ships meant tolerance, or simply that no one wanted to write it down. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sailors sometimes carved little hearts, initials, or even intertwined anchors into the wood of the ship, graffiti that scholars today puzzle over. Were these love notes between men?
Idle doubtless.
It's hard to prove, but the idea of secret confessions etched into planks gives you chills, like whispers frozen in timber, rocking across centuries.
Picture the scene. Two men on night watch, alone under the stars.
They lean against the rail, voices low, hands brushing just a little too long when passing the spyglass.
No one says, no one interrupts.
In that moment, the ocean itself seems to shield them, the horizon endless and silent. Tomorrow, they'll fight side by side, load cannons together, shout crude jokes with the crew. But tonight, in the quiet gap between duties, they allow themselves a stolen intimacy. Humor, of course, laced through it all. Sailors might laugh at two men always pairing up for chores, calling them inseparable as barnacles. It's teasing, but everyone knows that jokes are safe masks for truths. Better to laugh than to question, better to shrug than to accuse. And so, intimacy slipped beneath the sails, hiding in plain sight. Another mainstream fact: anthropologists studying shipboard life point out that extreme environments often produce situational sexuality, where desire bends to circumstance. The prison yard, the mining camp, the monastery all mirror what happened on ships. Men didn't necessarily label themselves differently for it. To them it was less about identity and more about need. Historians still debate whether we should call pirate intimacy gay history, or whether that framework imposes modern categories on men who might never have thought of themselves that way. You imagine the hammocks again, rows of them swaying, and wonder how many secrets were buried in that rhythm. Maybe one sailor curled closer than the others, maybe one hand reached out when no one was watching. There were no diaries detailing those nights, no confessions preserved, only silence. And silence can be louder than words. But secrecy wasn't absolute. Sometimes rumors bubbled into open knowledge. A crew might recognize two men as a pair without ever saying it aloud. They might even respect it, as long as it didn't interfere with duty. A man who fought bravely in battle or worked hard at the ropes could be forgiven almost anything. The pirate code valued loyalty above purity, and in that sense the love between men could even strengthen the ship's bond. Odd fact: in 1721, a report from French colonial authorities in Saint-Domingue described sailors who lived 2 by 2 as if married, noting that it was common among the freebooters. The officials wrote with disgust, but their very outrage confirms the practice. To you, standing in the imagined moonlight, it's less scandal and more inevitability.
When men are stripped of family, home, and comfort, they make new shapes of love. Think about it. The sea starves you of softness.
No warm embrace, no caress, just salt, stung skin and constant labor.
Against that deprivation, even small touches, an arm slung casually, a hand clasped too long, take on a charge. It's like sparks in the darkness, fleeting but undeniable. Humor, alcohol, and bravado all tried to mask it, but beneath the masks the hunger remained. And yet there was always danger. One wrong accusation, one enemy eager to discredit pirates, and intimacy could be weaponized. Pamphlets back in London painted pirates as unnatural villains, their ships as floating Sodoms. It's clear propaganda, but it also hints at how visible same-sex bonds may have been to outsiders.
Pirates lived beyond the law, but that didn't mean they were free from slander.
You lean against the mast, listening to the groan of ropes, and feel the paradox settle in. Forbidden yet unavoidable, hidden yet joked about, punished ashore but perhaps quietly tolerated at sea. Historians still argue whether pirates embraced these bonds openly or lived them in shadows, but you know the truth is probably both. Some ships turned blind eyes, others punished, others quietly celebrated loyalty without asking questions. The ocean doesn't keep neat categories. It swallows them whole, mixes them with salt, and tosses them back as mysteries.
What you know is this: in the rocking of hammocks and the hush of midnight watches, men found ways to be tender. And tenderness in a life so brutal might have been the boldest rebellion of all.
The waves roll steady tonicht, tapping the hull like a slow drum, and the smell of tar, salt, and damp canvas hangs thick in the air.
You followed the whispers of matlash and the shadowy bonds between sailors, but you can't ignore the next part of the story. The deliberate search for women in foreign ports, not in the rowdy brothels of Port Royal or Tortuga, but in the quieter corners where pirates carved out something closer to a household.
These were the long-term relationships, half love, half arrangement, that left their fingerprints on pirate history.
When a pirate crew made landfall in a Caribbean colony or a hidden cove, the men weren't just after rum and music. Many of them looked for women to spend not just a night but weeks, months, or even years with. These women were often local, African freed women, indigenous Caribbean women, or European settlers eking out a living at the edge of empire.
The connections weren't always fair or equal, but they were complex, weaving intimacy with survival, lust with loyalty.
A mainstream historical fact, the island of Tortuga, a French buccaneer haven, was famous in the mid-17th century for a system where French hunters, called buccaneers, paired with Caribbean women, particularly Taino and African-descended women. The French crown itself even tried to encourage these relationships to stabilize the colony. For pirates, this meant that forming bonds with local women wasn't just tolerated, it was expected, at least for a time. And here's a quirky tidbit: some pirates became so attached to their local partners that they essentially retired between voyages, living with these women in rustic huts and returning to the sea only when money ran dry.
You can picture it. A grizzled buccaneer chopping coconuts in the sun while his partner laughs at his clumsiness, a rare glimpse of domestic life for men otherwise known for blood and plunder.
Historians still argue whether these relationships were genuine romances or purely opportunistic. Some accounts describe deep loyalty, women following pirates from one island to another, even nursing wounds after battles. Other sources frame the connections as transactional, with women providing food, shelter, or sexual companionship in exchange for protection and a share of plunder. The truth, as always, likely sits somewhere in between. Imagine stepping into a small hut near the shoreline. Smoke curls from a fire where cassava bread bakes, and a pirate sits cross-legged while his partner weaves fishing nets.
Outside chickens clack and the ocean thunders just beyond the trace.
It's a world away from cannon fire and drunken taverns, but it's also fragile. The moment the sea calls again, that domestic bubble bursts, leaving only memories or heartbreak. Of course, pirates didn't always handle these bonds tenderly. Some men abandoned their partners without warning, leaving children behind. Colonial records mention mixed-race offspring of pirates, though the fathers' names often vanished like footprints in the sand. To the empires of Spain, England, or France, these children blurred the rigid racial categories imposed by law, and officials muttered uneasily about illegitimate mixtures threatening order. For the pirates, however, family was family, even if the wider world scorned it. Another odd fact: in the Bahamas, pirate leaders, including Benjamin Hornigold and Blackbeard's ally Charles Vane, were rumored to have kept local wives or mistresses in Nassau. These women weren't necessarily hidden, they were part of the chaotic pirate society that blossomed there around 1715 to 1725. Imagine a ragtag town where caverns doubled as living rooms, children darted between ramshackle houses, and pirate ships anchored like giant floating backyards.
Humor as usual crept in.
Crewmates might rib a pirate for going soft when he chose to stay with his woman instead of hitting the taverns. Jokes about married life at sea circulated constantly, with quips like, "He's tighter than a rope knot." But beneath the banter lay a truth. Many men longed for stability, even as they clung to the chaos of piracy. Historians still debate how widespread long-term partnerships were. Some insist they were rare exceptions in a world dominated by fleeting pleasures. Others argue that the lack of formal marriage records masks how common they actually were, especially with indigenous and African-descended women whose unions weren't recorded by colonial churches. Silence in the archives doesn't always mean absence, it can mean erasure. You picture the contradictions: a pirate feared by empires, tenderly rocking his child to sleep in a hammock strung between palm trees; a man known for plundering ships, pausing to help his partner plant yams in sandy soil. These moments don't fit the violent myth of piracy, but they existed, tucked in the margins of history like shells hidden beneath sand. But danger always loomed. Women attached to pirates risked as much as the men. When authorities cracked down, pirate families were uprooted. Partners were left behind, children orphaned or scattered. The pirate's freedom was often the woman's vulnerability, and the story of these bonds is as much tragedy as it is tenderness. Still, in the quiet spaces, love found its way. Maybe it wasn't love the way ballads describe it, dressed in flowers and vows. Maybe it was rough, improvised, built from hunger and fleeting safety. But on the edges of empire, with the ocean always whispering just beyond the shore, pirates carved out human connections that defied the cold laws of kings and churches. The ship sways beneath you, and you think of all the pirate children whose names never made it into books, of all the women whose stories dissolved in the tide. Their voices are faint, but if you close your eyes, you can almost hear them: laughter over cooking fires, lullabies blending with waves, whispered arguments about when or if the pirate will return. And you realize something: the sea may have been lawless, but the heart wasn't. Even in a world built on plunder, men still sought out tenderness, women still offered companionship, and families, however fragile, still bloomed in the salt air. The ship rocks gently now, sails billowing like ghostly lungs in the night, and the talk drifts toward something darker. The dangers that lurked in every brothel, every fleeting embrace, every desperate attempt to fill the void left by months at sea. You've seen the laughter, the matelotage vows, the makeshift households ashore, but now you face the costs, the hazards hidden beneath the rum and perfume. Because for every night of indulgence there were mornings of fever, shame, and wounds no cutlass could inflict. A mainstream historical fact, syphilis, often called the Great Pox, was rampant in the 17th and 18th centuries, spreading like wildfire through European ports, Caribbean colonies, and of course pirate havens. Sailors joked about it, sang about it, but feared it all the same. The disease could rot flesh, warp bones, and drive men into madness. On land, doctors prescribed mercury treatments. The infamous phrase, "a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," comes from this era. But aboard a pirate ship, medical care was little more than guesswork. You picture it, a pirate trembling in his hammock, sweating through the sheets, his crewmates muttering about bad luck. Maybe the ship's surgeon, if there even was one, applied some herbal poultice or dosed the poor man with a concoction of rum, gunpowder, and ground coral. Sometimes the treatment was worse than the illness. And yet these men kept flocking to brothels because the hunger outweighed the fear. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Port Royal, some brothel owners reportedly charged extra for women who claimed to be clean, a marketing gimmick that was as unreliable as a drunken compass. Sailors swore by tricks like inspecting a woman's tongue for spots or asking if she smelled of brimstone, as though such signs could reveal hidden sickness. Of course, none of it worked, but belief was often stronger than science. Historians still argue whether pirates truly suffered more from venereal disease than other sailors, or if they were simply blamed more loudly because of their reputation. Some records paint them as filthy vectors of contagion, spreading sickness from island to island. Others suggest their risks were no greater than any merchant or naval crew. The truth buried in the silence of medical logs and the exaggerations of moralists remains unclear.
Imagine the irony, a man who survives cannon fire, hurricanes, and mutinies, only to be undone by a rash he picked up in a smoky back room. It's almost cruel, and yet it was reality. Pirates laughed at death, but disease wasn't as entertaining. It lingered, it gnawed, it made men shadows of themselves. And unlike a battle wound, there was no glory in it.
Of course, it wasn't just syphilis. Gonorrhea, known then as the clap, also spread widely. Sailors whispered crude jokes about it, blaming it on witches, bad rum, or even curses from angry mermaids. Humor softened the terror. A pirate staggering back to the ship might laugh it off, saying, "She gave me more fire than a Spanish galleon," while the quartermaster rolled his eyes. Beneath the laughter, though, was the knowledge that the sickness might last far longer than the memory of the night that caused it. Another mainstream fact, some navies tried to enforce health checks on brothels near their ports, but in pirate havens there was no such regulation. Nassau, Tortuga, Port Royal, these places thrived precisely because they operated beyond the grasp of empire. That freedom was intoxicating, but it came with consequences. Pirates paid the price in their bodies even as they boasted of their liberty. Oddly enough, not all dangers were biological. Jealousy and violence often followed pirate indulgences. Brothels were notorious for brawls, with men fighting over women, money, or perceived slights. Some pirates never made it back to their ships, their bodies left bleeding in alleys after drunken quarrels. The pursuit of pleasure could end in death as surely as any naval battle. You lean against the ship's railing in your mind, listening to the creak of the timbers, and feel how fragile it all was. Pirates carved out moments of joy, but they came at high cost. One slip, one rash decision, and a man might be crippled, scarred, or dead. Yet the cycle never broke. The hunger for touch was stronger than the fear of pain. Historians still debate whether pirates warned each other, shared knowledge about symptoms, or simply shrugged and carried on. Some suggest that older sailors passed down folk remedies, like washing with vinegar after sex or carrying charms of garlic and brass. Were these cures effective? I must never. But they gave men the illusion of control in a world that otherwise stripped them of it. Humor, again, became survival. A pirate might limp onto the deck after a week ashore, and the crew would tease him mercilessly, calling him Spotted Jack or Sir H-a-lot. The laughter masked the grim truth. Everyone knew it could be them next. On a ship with no escape, sickness spread as easily as rumor, and both were impossible to contain. Picture the cycle osmore, plunder, pot, brutal favor. It's almost mechanical, a rhythm as steady as the tide. Pirates weren't blind to the dangers, they just accepted them as part of the price of living free. Better a short, fiery life with pleasures and pain than a long, dull one, shackled to empire. That was the creed, and disease was just another cannonball waiting in the dark. So you settle deeper into the hammock, hearing the whisper of waves, and realize the irony. Pirates fled laws, kings, and navies, but they could never outrun their own bodies. In the end, the lack of sex at sea wasn't the only danger. It was the desperate answer they found ashore, and the shadows it carried back with them onto the deck. You hear the creak of the rigging, the hiss of waves sliding past the hull, and you're reminded of something far older than pirate codes or tavern songs: superstition. Out here, where the sea itself feels alive, every act carries weight. And when it came to lust, sailors carried a thick cargo of beliefs, warnings, and half-whispered taboos. You might laugh at them now, but when you're dangling between sky and abyss, those stories cling to you like salt spray. The mainstream fact is simple. Sailors of the early modern world, including pirates, genuinely believed that certain behaviors could stir up storms. Sex aboard ship was one of them. The sea was seen as a jealous woman, easily offended, quick to wrath. A single act of lust in a hammock might, in their minds, rouse Neptune's fury, tearing sails and snapping masts. It wasn't just gossip, it shaped discipline. Some captains outright forbade sexual contact on board, not only because of quarrels or disease, but because they feared the heavens would punish them. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Scandinavian folklore, there was an idea that if you whistled on a ship, you could call the wind. But if you whistled after lying with someone in secret, the winds that came would be no gentle breeze. It would be a gale, smashing timbers and flinging men into the deep. Pirates, ever the practical jokers, sometimes teased each other by whistling after spotting a crewmate sneaking below deck. Imagine the poor man's face caught between superstition and embarrassment, sure he'd doomed the whole voyage. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were sincerely held or just convenient excuses for keeping order. Some claim pirate captains leaned into superstition to prevent fights or jealousy, turning myths into makeshift law. Others think the sailors themselves truly believed the sea had moods, like a lover scorned. And maybe both were true, depending on the crew, the storm, the shadows on the water.
You picture it now, lightning flaring across the horizon, waves rising like dark mountains. The men mutter that someone must have broken the unspoken rules. My bat reist in the shadows, my ptukak's too lustful for the sea's liking.
Eyes dart from hammock to hammock, suspicion brewing alongside the storm. In the chaos, it almost doesn't matter if it's true. The fear itself binds them. And yet, there's humor in it too. A pirate might joke that the only thing his lust summoned was the quartermaster's wrath, or that Neptune himself must be jealous of his charms. These jests softened the edges of fear, but they also admitted the tension. When the wind howled, every man wondered if their shipmates' hunger had tipped the balance.
Oddly enough, superstition and religion tangled together here.
The church condemned lust at sea as sin, while sailors rebranded it as bad luck. Two explanations for the same fear, two languages for the same unease. You wonder, did pirates pray before their brothel visits ashore, or did they laugh at the gods entirely? The records are thin, but the whispers suggest both. Another historical fact worth noting, women on ships were themselves considered unlucky. Naval traditions barred them not only for practical reasons, but because of the belief that their presence angered the sea. Some pirates broke this rule, and Bonnie Mary Read, but even then the crew often joked or worried that storms followed them like curses. Was it really about women, or about the simmering desires they represented? Hard to say, but either way, the sea became the stage for endless debates. The funny thing is, lust wasn't the only thing blamed. Sailors thought eating certain foods, cutting hair at sea, or even killing seabirds could summon storms. Desire just happened to be one of the more scandalous sins on the list. When you're living in a floating wooden coffin, every creak and splash feels like a sign, and every sign demands an explanation. So why not blame that stolen kiss below deck? You can almost hear the mock trials. A pirate accused of angering the sea might be teased, dunked with seawater, or warned never to repeat his crime. It wasn't exactly science, but it reinforced the invisible boundary: on land, anything goes. At sea, restraint, at least in public, was safer. Historians still debate whether fear of storms actually curbed pirate behavior, or if it was just another story sailors told themselves on sleepless nights. Some argue that superstition only masked the real concerns: jealousy, disease, distraction. Others think belief in curses was so ingrained that men genuinely checked themselves.
And when you stare into the endless black water, it's easy to see why.
The sensory weight of it presses down now, the reek of wet hemp, the taste of salt on your lips, the groan of the hull as the ship climbs a wave. If you've ever felt small beneath a thunderstorm, multiply that by 1,000. That's the scale of fear these men carried. And into that fear, lust slithered like a spark in dry straw, dangerous, irresistible, and maybe catastrophic. One last quirky note, some sailors thought that if you absolutely couldn't resist your urges at sea, you had to appease the ocean afterward by tossing coins, rum, or even a lock of hair overboard. A sort of offering, a way of saying, sorry about that, don't thank us. Did it work? The fact that you're listening means at least some of them survived. So here you are, swaying with the ship, caught between laughter and dread. Lust wasn't just personal out here, it was cosmic, tied to weather, fate, and the temper of the waves. Pirates mocked it, feared it, and sometimes believed in it with their whole salt-crusted souls. And as the storm passes, sails torn but ship still afloat, you realize maybe superstition was less about truth and more about control, a way to make sense of the chaos when the sea was always just one heartbeat away from swallowing everything. You lean into the hammock of your mind again, hearing the murmurs of men trying to shake off tension, and the way they did it wasn't always through superstition or rum, it was through humor. Not gentle humor, but the loud, bawdy kind, the sort that fills the night air with laughter sharp enough to cut through fear. Because when you're trapped on a ship with 100 restless souls, weeks from the nearest port, sometimes the only relief from desire is a filthy song or a joke that leaves half the crew howling. The mainstream fact here is that sailors and pirates alike were notorious for their sea shanties, work songs that set the rhythm for hauling lines or heaving anchors. But along with the functional chants came bawdy verses, improvised limericks, and obscene parodies of hymns. Historians have recorded fragments, songs about women in every port, about encounters with mermaids, about longing for a night in a warm bed. One sailor's version of a tune might be innocent enough, but once a pirate crew got hold of it, the lyrics transformed into something your grandmother would faint over. Now picture this, a moonlit deck that's glimmering white, and the crew gathered in a loose circle. Someone starts a song about a maiden fair, and within seconds another voice twists the line into a crude pun, sending the crowd into raucous laughter. The verses get dirtier, the metaphors more ridiculous. A refrain that once spoke of love now rhymes with words about body parts or absurd acts with barnyard animals. You laugh because the silliness itself breaks the monotony, and for a few minutes you forget the gnawing absence of real intimacy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sailors often carved body images or little jokes into the ship's timbers. Archaeologists have found graffiti in old vessels, drawings of naked women, lewd caricatures, even playful sketches of their captains. Imagine crouching in the dim hold, running your fingers across a doodle scratched with a knife centuries ago, realizing that even back then, humor was their graffiti therapy. The pirates who scrawled it weren't just being crude, they were leaving behind their frustration in the only permanent way they could. Historians still argue whether these dirty jokes served as genuine catharsis or as a form of group bonding. Some suggest the humor was a pressure valve, letting men laugh off their shared struggles with lust, loneliness, and fear. Others think it was also a way of building hierarchy. The loudest, wittiest pirate got status by making the others roar with laughter. Either way, the deck became a stage, and the script was always a little obscene. The jokes didn't always stay harmless, though. Sometimes humor turned into mockery, and mockery into fights. A pirate teased too harshly about another's lack of success ashore might find himself challenged to a duel or slugged across the jaw. But even that was part of the rhythm. Humor teetered constantly between camaraderie and conflict, just like everything else in pirate life. And yet, amid all the raunchy lyrics and crude sketches, there was creativity. Pirates spun elaborate tales of fictional adventures, often sexual in nature, exaggerated to cartoonish levels. You can almost hear one pirate boasting, "She was taller than the mainmast, and I climbed her just the same." The crew roared, not because they believed him, but because the absurdity filled the void. In a life where real pleasure was rationed, exaggeration became its own entertainment. Another mainstream fact, literacy was rare among sailors, but oral storytelling thrived. Dirty jokes were part of that oral culture, handed down, reshaped, exaggerated.
It wasn't about accuracy, it was about flair. You couldn't keep a diary of lust aboard ship without risking ridicule, but you could turn it into a joke, and that joke could echo for weeks.
Humor also mingled with superstition. A pirate might pretend to whisper sweet nothings to the sea, as though flirting with the waves, then mock complain when the wind picked up. Everyone laughed, but beneath the joke was that flicker of belief you saw earlier, the sense that lust and storms were somehow linked. By laughing at it, they made it less frightening. Quirky superstition found its way into jokes too. One tale told of a sailor who tried to kiss a mermaid only for her to slap him with a fish and vanish. Was it true? Of course not. But every retelling grew filthier, every detail more absurd. By the 10th version, the mermaid was demanding gifts of rum, gold, and a parrot before anything happened. You picture yourself there, leaning against a barrel, grinning as the crew invents these tales, voices hoarse from laughter. The salt air is thick with smoke, the stars blazing overhead, and for a while the hunger that stalks every man is drowned out in jokes. This isn't just crude humor, it's survival. Historians still debate whether bawdy humor truly replaced physical intimacy or merely disguised the aching need. Did pirates feel relief after laughing about their desires, or did it make the absence sharper? The record is silent on feelings, but you can imagine both, laughter soothing the ache for a night only for it to creep back in the silence after the last chuckle fades. And yes, sometimes the humor went a little too far. Pirates were known for pulling practical jokes too, sneaking into hammocks, tying knots in trousers, leaving lewd drawings in a man's sea chest. Imagine stumbling half asleep to find your only shirt covered in crude chalk sketches. Do you laugh or do you curse? Probably both. There's something almost childlike in it. Grown men, hardened killers, reduced to giggling over rhymes and pranks. And yet, that's exactly what kept them human. Violence and death were daily companions, but so was laughter, even the kind that would make polite society blush. So you let the voices of the crew wash over you, the mix of shanties, ribald jokes, and exaggerated tales. Each laugh is a release, a shield against loneliness, a reminder that they're all stuck in the same floating prison of desire. No, humor can't replace intimacy, but it can stitch together a night, keep the shadows at bay, and maybe even make you smile long enough to forget what's missing. And when dawn comes and the songs fade into yawns, you realize the truth. Pirates didn't just fight storms with sails and superstition. They fought them with laughter, with crude rhymes shouted into the wind. Humor was their anchor, and sometimes it held.
The deck is quieter now, the moon low, but you notice another constant companion in the life of a pirate home.
The bottle passes from hand to hand, sloshing amber liquid into chipped cups, and with every swallow the edges of longing blur. If bawdy jokes were one coping mechanism, alcohol was another, stronger, heavier, and more dangerous. You watch as desire, fear, and loneliness dissolve into drunken laughter, reckless boasts, or sometimes just the heavy snoring of a man who can't face the silence without drink. A mainstream historical fact, rum became the sailors' drink of choice in the Caribbean after the mid-1600s. It was cheap, strong, and plentiful, brewed from sugarcane byproducts in local distilleries. Pirates, who often raided ships carrying barrels of the stuff, treated it as liquid gold. Sometimes they drank it neat, sometimes mixed with water to make grog, a word that later drifted into naval slang. For them, it wasn't just a drink, it was an answer to every problem. Bored? Rum. Cold? Rum. Lonely? Rum. Rum helped dull the ache. You picture the scene in a port tavern, pirates slamming mugs onto sticky tables, toasting to conquests, singing louder as the rum burns down their throats. The warmth spreads, loosens tongues, and suddenly the hunger for intimacy is drowned beneath laughter and slurred boasts.
One pirate swears he'll marry a tavern girl, another declares he doesn't need anyone but his bottle, and another passes out before finishing his sentence. Alcohol becomes the stand-in lover, offering comfort without commitment, release without rejection.
Here's a quirky tidbit. Some pirates believed rum had mystical properties. There are accounts of sailors rubbing it on wounds, claiming it could ward off infection. Others even used it as cologne before visiting brothels, splashing it onto their clothes in the hope of smelling more appealing. Imagine trying to impress someone while reeking of molasses and stale sweat, romantic in a very pirate way. Historians still argue whether pirates drank more heavily than ordinary sailors, or if their image as rum-soaked rogues has been exaggerated. Some suggest they actually rationed alcohol carefully, since a drunken crew couldn't fight or sail effectively. Others argue the opposite, that without the strict discipline of a navy, pirates drank as freely as they pleased, leading to chaos and accidents. The truth likely lies somewhere between wild binges ashore, but moderation when survival demanded it. On board, rum played another role. It became social glue. Sharing a bottle was a ritual, a way of affirming bonds. A man who hoarded drink risked resentment, but one who poured generously earned trust. In the absence of family or stable relationships, rum was the family table. Pirates laughed together, argued together, and sometimes wept together with a cup in hand. But it wasn't all warmth. Alcohol, as you know, can twist moods as easily as it soothes them. Fights often broke out after too much rum, with pirates drawing knives over insults that would have been brushed aside in sobriety. Jealousies over women ashore, frustrations about loot, or simmering rivalries erupted in drunken brawls.
You can imagine a dimly lit deck, lanterns swaying as two half-drunken pirates grapple over spilled grog, their curses echoing louder than the sea.
And here's the irony, rum sometimes fueled the very lust it was meant to soften. A drunk pirate, bold and reckless, might stumble ashore determined to satisfy his cravings no matter the cost. Brothel owners knew this and raised prices when ships came in with coin and thirst. Desire, dulled at sea, flared uncontrollably with the help of alcohol on land, sometimes leading to disease, fights, or worse. One mainstream fact worth remembering, the British Navy issued daily rations of rum well into the 20th century, proof of how entrenched the drink became in seafaring culture. Pirates, though lawless, mirrored this practice in their own way. Their Articles of Agreement, the pirate codes, sometimes included rules about alcohol. A ship that drank itself senseless was an easy target, so even the wildest crews tried to balance indulgence with survival. And yet, pirates loved their excesses. You can almost hear a drunk pirate bragging, "A man who fears rum should have stayed on land." The laughter follows, but so does the wobble in his step, the glassy look in his eye. Rum didn't just blur loneliness, it blurred reality, making men forget how fragile their floating world really was. Another quirky note, pirates sometimes mixed gunpowder with rum and drank it before battle, believing it made them braver. Did it work? Not really, unless you count coughing and nausea as courage. But the ritual itself mattered, the feeling of being invincible, untouchable, ready to charge into chaos. It's the same energy that made them face storms and enemies, even when the odds were impossible. Historians still debate how much alcohol fueled piracy itself. Did it create the reckless boldness that made men attack galleons against all odds? Or did it simply ease the grind of waiting, the endless monotony between battles? Perhaps it did both, stoking fire when needed and softening sorrow when the sea stretched too wide. And yes, jokes came with it. Pirates teased each other about marrying the bottle or claimed that rum was the only woman who never left. You laugh at the image, hundreds of rough men competing for the affection of a barrel. But the humor has truth. In a life where intimacy was fleeting and dangerous, alcohol was the one constant partner. Picture it one last time, the lantern light flickering, Mock's raised voice lewd and slurred.
The Xerox Bennett you, but for now you don't care.
The craving in your body has dulled, replaced by warmth in your veins and laughter in your ears. Tomorrow may bring storms, fights, or fevers, but tonight rum holds you like an old friend, and that's enough. The night air is heavy with spice and smoke as you step into a bustling port, lanterns swaying above narrow alleys where music, laughter, and shouting spill from every corner. For months you've been staring at the same faces, the same stretch of sea, the same routines of rope and rum. But here ashore the world feels impossibly wide. Exotic ports meant exotic encounters, and pirates, always hungry for novelty, dove headlong into the swirl of new cultures, markets, and fleeting affairs. A mainstream historical fact, pirate havens like Nassau, Port Royal, and Tortuga weren't just European outposts. They were crossroads where African, indigenous, and European peoples all mingled. The Caribbean in the 17th and 18th centuries was a mosaic of languages, traditions, and customs pulled together by trade, conquest, and the ceaseless traffic of ships. Pirates were outsiders in many ways, but their presence tied them to this blend. And when it came to intimacy, these encounters were often as much about curiosity as desire. Imagine it, a pirate stepping into a market in Havana, his eyes wide at the riot of colors, bright fabrics, strange fruits, beads strung with shells. A woman offers him roasted plantains, another sells necklaces carved from bone. Maybe he buys something, not for trade, but as a token, a way of bridging the gap. The exchange might lead to laughter, shared drink, even a brief romance that burns fast and fades faster. Here's a quirky tidbit. Pirates sometimes adopted local fashions after spending time in foreign ports. Some tied beads into their hair, wore bright sashes from the Indies, or carried charms given by women they met ashore. These weren't just souvenirs, they were badges of memory, talismans of encounters that might have lasted a single night or a handful of weeks. Imagine a hardened pirate boasting not about gold, but about the scarf tied around his waist, insisting it carried luck because it came from a lover in Cartagena. Historians still argue how consensual these cross-cultural relationships really were. Some accounts suggest pirates treated women of local communities as equals, even forming semi-permanent bonds with them. Others paint a harsher picture where power imbalance and coercion definite the encounters. The truth is tangled, lost in biased records and missing voices. Were these affairs true connections across cultural lines, or simply another form of exploitation masked as romance? The debate lingers like smoke from a tavern lamp. But what's certain is that ports offered pirates something the sea never could: variety. After months of hunger, the sudden flood of new sights, tastes, and touches was overwhelming. You might laugh now, but think about it. Imagine eating salted beef for a year, then suddenly biting into a ripe mango. That same shock of sweetness played out in human encounters. Pirates were fascinated, intoxicated, and often reckless. One mainstream fact worth noting, in places like Madagascar, where some pirate crews anchored for long stretches, men sometimes took local wives. These weren't always brief flings, but arrangements that tied pirates to communities. Some stayed behind entirely, building lives far from Europe. For them, intimacy wasn't just about release, it was about belonging. The line between pirate and settler blurred, stitched together by relationships born in exotic ports. And then there were the stories, half true, half invented, that pirates carried back to their ships. One swore he'd courted the daughter of an island chief, another claimed a goddess had visited him in disguise. The tales grew taller with each retelling, feeding the crew's fantasies as much as any brothel ever did. Whether or not the stories were real didn't matter, they gave color to the gray days at sea. Of course, these encounters carried risks too. Cultural misunderstandings could spark conflict. A pirate mistaking flirtation for invitation might find himself chased by angry relatives or guards. In some places, men who disrespected local customs faced harsh punishment, even execution.
Desire was dangerous, not just because of disease, but because it could ignite entire communities against a crew.
Here's another quirky note. Some pirates kept small trinkets, not of gold, but of affection. Locks of hair, carved tokens, folded scraps of fabric. These keepsakes became secret treasures, hidden in sea chests alongside stolen jewels. The crew might joke about them, but every man knew the weight of such a token. It meant someone ashore had touched his life, even if only for a fleeting moment. Historians still debate how much of pirate lore about exotic loves was truth and how much was fantasy written by later storytellers. Romantic novels of the 19th century painted pirates as lovers of foreign princesses and mysterious women in silk. Was it real history or just projection? Perhaps a little of both.
Pirates themselves spun their own myths, so who's to say where reality stopped and story began?
You can almost feel it now, the heat of a kraut pot, the spice ladene, the press of Stranges brushing past. For a pirate, every sense was flooded, every encounter a chance to forget the emptiness of sea life. Desire wasn't just about sex, it was about immersion, losing yourself in something wildly different, tasting the world's variety one stolen kiss at a time. But the tide always turned. Ports were temporary, affairs shorter still. A pirate might wake one morning to find his lover gone, or his ship sailing at dawn. Hearts weren't meant to linger in such lives. Still, those encounters, however brief, left marks, scars, yes, but also memories that warmed men in hammocks during endless nights. So when you picture pirates ashore, don't only see the brawls and brothels. See them wandering markets, curious and reckless, drawn to the unfamiliar. See them carrying tokens tucked secretly into belts, humming songs they learned from strangers. These exotic encounters didn't erase the hunger at sea, but they flavored it, added spice to the otherwise bland broth of loneliness. And as the ship sails again, the port fading behind, you realize the truth. Pirates were collectors not only of gold and loot, but of fleeting connections, moments of passion, tenderness, or simply curiosity that stitched together the restless patchwork of their lives.
A sea air feels colder tonight, not because of the wind, but because of what you're about to face, the price pirates paid when desire followed them home in ways they couldn't ignore. For all the jokes, the rum, the fleeting affairs in brothels or ports, there was always a darker shadow lurking, the specter of disease. It stalked the hammocks, whispered through taverns, and mocked the bodies of men who thought themselves invincible. You hear the cough, the groan, the muttered curses, and you know this chapter of pirate life wasn't glamorous. A mainstream historical fact, syphilis, nicknamed the Great Pox, was rampant in the 17th and 18th centuries. By the time of the so-called Golden Age of piracy, it had already carved a deadly path across Europe and the Americas. Symptoms could start small, sores, rashes, but over time it ate into bones, scarred skin, and even gnawed at the brain, driving men into madness. On land, physicians tried everything from mercury ointments to arsenic potions, but aboard a pirate ship, treatments were far more desperate. You can imagine the ship's surgeon, if there was one at all, fumbling with crude remedies, scraping sores, dabbing with vinegar, or dosing a man with whatever concoction came to hand, rum, crushed herbs, sometimes even ground seashells. Nothing really worked. The illness lingered, worsened, and spread.
And yet, when the ship anchored near a port, those same men stumbled ashore again, drawn by the very hunger that had doomed them.
Here's a quirky tidbit. Sailors had nicknames for their diseases. Gonorrhea was the clap, syphilis was the pox, and both were wrapped in gallows humor. A man might joke he'd been kissed by Venus or that he'd won a prize in Tortuga's lottery. You laugh because what else can you do when the cure is worse than the cause? Mercury rubs burned the skin, made teeth fall out, and poisoned the body slowly, yet many believed it was better than letting the sickness run unchecked.
Historians still argue whether pirates truly suffered more from venereal disease than other seafarers, or if moralists exaggerated their plight. Navy men visited brothels too, merchants lingered in taverns, and soldiers weren't saints either. But pirates, already painted as lawless sinners, became the convenient scapegoats. Records from colonial governors thunder about plague-ridden rogues, yet how much was fact and how much was propaganda to justify hanging them? The debate remains as murky as a Caribbean harbor at dusk. But imagine the misery of it firsthand. A pirate itching constantly in his hammock, mocked by shipmates who fear catching it yet laugh to hide their own anxiety. Another pirate, his nose collapsing from advanced syphilis, pulling a scarf tight around his face. They joke, yes, but beneath the laughter is shame, fear, and a creeping sense of mortality. Death in battle was fast and fiery.
Death from disease was slow, humiliating, and unheroic. The danger wasn't just to the men themselves. Ships became floating hotbeds of contagion. A single Nichtindulgenz ashore mich the Rippler trug the crew, leaving dozens infected.
Quarters were tight, hygiene minimal, and rumors even tighter. Soon, every cough or rash sparked whispers. Was it the pox? Was it cursed luck? Sometimes men were abandoned ashore, left behind as unfit to sail, a cruel kind of exile for those too sick to fight or work.
Another mainstream fact, the spread of venereal disease shaped colonial policy. Some governors attempted to regulate brothels, ordering health checks or quarantines. In places like Havana and Port Royal, licensed women were inspected, though often half-heartedly. Pirates, however, thrived in unregulated havens like Nassau or Tortuga, where no one asked questions and everyone knew the risks. Freedom came at the cost of safety. And yet, disease didn't stop the cycle. Pirates joked, drank, and courted danger anyway. Maybe it was fatalism, better to live fast and burn out than rot in chains. Maybe it was simple denial, or maybe the hunger was just stronger than fear. After months at sea with only hammocks and bawdy jokes for company, the risk of a fever tomorrow seemed small compared to the warmth of another body tonight. Here's another quirky note. Some sailors believed strange cures could ward off disease. Washing in seawater, eating citrus, even wearing charms of garlic or brass coins around the neck. One legend claimed that a mixture of tobacco juice and gunpowder rubbed on the skin could cure the clap. Did it work? Not even a little. But belief gave comfort, and comfort was often all they had. Historians still debate how much disease shaped pirate culture itself. Did constant sickness harden them, making them more reckless? Or did it bind crews together, forcing men to accept each other's flaws and failings? The truth is probably both. On a ship where everyone suffered something, scars, fevers, sores, the line between shame and normality blurred.
Picture yourself in the flickering lantern light below deck.
The air is thick, foul with sweat, smoke, and the sour tang of illness. A man groans in his hammock, another scratches raw skin, another mutters a prayer he barely believes in. Yet above it all, you hear laughter, jokes about syphilitic mermaids, bawdy songs mocking their own misery. It's grim, yes, but also strangely defiant. Humor became armor, because without it, despair would sink the ship faster than any storm. The cost of desire was written in their bodies, carved into bones, and whispered in the spaces between hammocks. And yet, pirates pressed on, knowing the risks but unwilling to abandon the brief flashes of joy that made the endless sea bearable. Disease was the price of hunger, and hunger was the price of being human. So when you think of pirates swaggering into brothels or boasting of lovers in exotic ports, remember the shadow that followed them back aboard. The laughter and the warmth had consequences, and those consequences traveled with them, hidden under scarves, in fevers, and in the silent knowledge that tomorrow might bring more pain than plunder.
And as you rest in your hammock tonight, you feel it too, that uneasy truth that no amount of swagger or rum could erase. Pirates dealt with desire not by avoiding it, but by accepting the danger and diving in anyway, even when the kiss carried poison. The sea rolls beneath you, endless and indifferent, and you realize that for pirates, dealing with desire wasn't always about chasing women ashore or drowning thoughts in rum. Sometimes the answer was stranger, turning hunger into ritual, superstition, or something resembling faith. In the dark nights between storms, when the stars wheeled above and the ocean whispered louder than laughter, pirates found ways to anchor their urges not just in flesh, but in symbols, charms, and stories.
You shift on the creaking deck, watching arm and kiss a carved talking before slipping it under his shirt. For him, that little scrap of belief was stronger than loneliness.
A mainstream historical fact, sailors, including pirates, were notoriously superstitious. They carried charms against bad luck, feared whistling on deck it whistled up a storm, and tattooed themselves with symbols meant to protect them from drowning. Among these charms, some were explicitly linked to desire. A man might keep a lock of hair tied with ribbon, claiming it belonged to a lover in Havana. Another wore rings bought from fortune-tellers who promised they'd guard him from women's curses. These little talismans served as stand-ins for intimacy, a way to feel connected even when the sea swallowed all closeness. And yet, the belief could go further. Imagine pirates gathering by lantern light, half-drunk, trading stories about magical remedies for lust. One swears that carrying a dried frog in his pocket keeps his blood cooled. Another laughs, insisting that rubbing copper coins together wards off disease. Someone else boasts that eating certain herbs before visiting a brothel means you'll never catch the pox. None of it worked, of course, but in a world without doctors or certainty, superstition was medicine for the mind. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some pirates believed the sea itself had moods and would punish men who indulged too freely. There were tales that Poseidon, or his Caribbean cousin imagined as a wrathful sea spirit, grew jealous when sailors loved women more than the waves. So if a ship had too many nights of excess ashore, some whispered that storms followed them out of port. You grin at the thought of Neptune himself sulking because a pirate preferred a tavern girl over the ocean's embrace. Historians still argue whether pirates actually blended organized religion into their sexual lives, or if those stories came from later moralists trying to shame them. Some accounts show pirates mocking church rituals, even dressing priests in women's clothes as a joke. Others, however, describe moments when they turned desperate prayers into intimate pleas, asking saints or the Virgin Mary for forgiveness not just for killing, but for lust. Did pirates pray earnestly, or did they parody prayer as they parodied authority?
The debate still flickers like a lantern in the wind.
On board, you can see the rituals. A pirate carving his lover's name into the mast. Another muttering over dice before tossing them as if the outcome decides whether he'll be lucky in love next port. Some believed in lucky garments, red sashes tied tight before docking, certain earrings worn as tokens of fertility. Even tattoos carried layers of superstition. Anchors for stability, swallows for safe return, and sometimes crude hearts or names inked by shipmates to lock desire to the skin. Superstition also shaped behavior in brothels.
Some pirates knocked 3 times on the door for luck.
Others refused the first girl offered, claiming she was cursed, and instead chose the second or third. Still others carried small charms into bed, as if a token of brass or bone could protect them better than any herbal wash. You smile at the image of a swaggering pirate, scarred and swaggering, clutching a rabbit's foot under the sheets.
Another mainstream fact, maritime folklore often linked lust with punishment. Tales of sailors who offended the sea by breaking taboos, bringing women aboard, or boasting too loudly of their conquests were common. Some versions claimed such men were dragged down by mermaids, not the lovely kind, but sharp-toothed sirens who devoured them whole. The message was clear: unchecked desire could doom you. Pirates, practical as they were, still carried those stories in the back of their minds. Here's another quirky note. Some pirates used coded songs as a way to both vent their frustration and protect themselves from judgment. A bawdy shanty sung at the capstan wasn't just humor, it was ritual release. By turning desire into rhythm, by laughing together through verse, they transformed hunger into tradition. And when the song ended, the ache felt less sharp, like it had been shared among many voices instead of festering alone. Historians still debate whether pirates' superstitions about sex were sincere or just convenient cover. Did they truly believe charms kept them safe, or was it just easier to pretend? After all, when you've seen storms wreck ships, sharks circle like vultures, and men die from a scratch, the line between rationality and magic blurs. For a pirate, believing a trinket could guard his body wasn't so different from believing a pistol would save him in battle. It gave courage, and courage was survival. Picture it, the night Dape, the ship rocking gently, a pirate tracing a shambus rock fingers. He whispers the name of a woman he hasn't seen in months, maybe years. Around him, others hum old songs, fiddle with dice, or mutter prayers twisted into jokes. The air smells of tar and sweat, the deck creaks, and above it all the stars scatter like coins spilled from some celestial chest. Desire hasn't vanished, but superstition has softened it, turned raw hunger into ritual, and ritual into something almost holy.
And you realize, for men adrift on endless waters, superstition wasn't foolishness.
It was survival.
The little carved tokens, the whispered prayers, the half-joking charms, these were their ways of making sense of longing that had no easy outlet. In a life where tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, belief was the only constant, and even lust was wrapped inside it like a secret prayer.
The lantern light flickers across the deck, casting long shadows, and you catch the low murmur of men talking about something far more delicate than treasure or battles: how pirates found scraps of real affection in a world of fleeting encounters. Desire wasn't always just lust. Sometimes it softened into companionship, or at least the closest thing to it that a drifting, dangerous life could allow.
And here, in this strange family forged by piracy, you see glimpses of bonds that went deeper than gold or grog.
A mainstream historical fact: pirate crews often described themselves as brotherhoods, sworn together under articles of agreement. These codes weren't just about loot, they included clauses on fairness, loyalty, and sometimes even provisions for wounded crewmen. Pirates shared more equally than naval or merchant sailors, and this equality created a sense of fraternity.
Out of that closeness, it's no surprise that emotional bonds, sometimes even romantic ones, emerged.
You picture two pirates, laughing as they mend sails side by side, or sharing a hammock on cold nights. The sea strips of privacy and necessity forces closeness.
Desire might start with jokes and rum, but it could grow into comfort. Someone who listened when the night stretched too long, someone who remembered your story. For men who had left families behind or who never had one at all, a shipmate could become more than a comrade. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some Caribbean settlements, there was a custom known as mateloage. This practice paired men together in legal-like partnerships where they shared property, plunder, and sometimes even inheritance. Some historians argue that mateloage was purely economic, two men pooling resources to survive. Others suggest it had emotional or even romantic undertones, making it one of history's more curious arrangements. Picture pirates signing a contract not just to split gold, but to split life itself. Historians still argue whether mateloage was widespread among pirates or whether the sources exaggerate it. Some accounts come from colonial authorities eager to slander pirates as immoral. Others describe it more neutrally as a practical alliance. Was it love? Was it friendship? Was it survival? The debate still swirls like smoke rising from a tavern lamp. On board, companionship also showed in small gestures. A pirate who won a share of plunder might spend it not on himself, but on trinkets for his closest friend. One might guard another in battle more fiercely than treasure itself. In a world where tomorrow wasn't promised, the bonds between men mattered more than promises ashore. Another mainstream fact, pirate ships were often filled with outcasts, escaped slaves, debtors, political rebels, and sailors fleeing harsh navies. This mix created a unique culture where traditional rules of class or nationality broke down. Out of this patchwork, unexpected loyalties formed. A pirate from France might call a pirate from Africa his brother, and together they'd swear to share everything from loot to bedding. Such closeness blurred lines, especially when it came to filling the void left by absent lovers or wives. Here's another quirky note. Some pirates openly referred to their closest companions as "my wife," even if no woman was involved. Was it a joke? A way of mocking landlubbers? Maybe. But it also revealed a truth, that in the absence of traditional family, pirates created their own. Laughter covered the reality. Sometimes the bonds were deeper than anyone dared say aloud.
Historians still debate whether pirate companionship should be read as evidence of same-sex relationships or if we project modern categories backward onto the past. The truth is tangled. Some pirates probably did share intimacy with one another, but others may have simply used the language of marriage to describe brotherhood.
What's clear is that in a world of hunger and danger, pirates clung fiercely to whatever closeness they could find.
You can imagine the tenderness hidden beneath Rook's surface.
A pirate tucking a blanket over his sick crewmate. Another holding a friend's head after too much rum, making sure he didn't choke. These aren't the gestures you'd expect from men painted as villains, yet they happened quietly beneath the noise of battle songs and cannon fire. Companionship also gave pirates a sense of permanence in a transient world. Lovers in brothels came and went, coins ran dry, but a shipmate remained, laughing, swearing, fighting at your side. When pirates swore to live together and die together, it wasn't empty bravado. For some, it was the only vow of loyalty they would ever make. Picture it one last time, two men sharing the rail at sunset, trading stories about ports they'll never see again. They laugh, argue, maybe even shoulder against each other in the quiet. Around them the sea stretches wide, a reminder of loneliness. But for this moment, they aren't alone. The hunger has shifted into something warmer, softer, not sated, but eased. And so, amid the stereotypes of rowdy taverns and fleeting flings, there was this quieter truth. Some pirates dealt with their desires by transforming them into bonds of trust, into partnerships that felt almost like marriages, into companionships that mattered more than fleeting pleasure. Lust burned fast, loyalty burned longer. And though historians may never agree exactly what form those bonds took, you feel it in your bones. The sea was cruel, but sometimes it also gave space for love, in whatever shape it could survive. The horizon burns orange as the sun dips low, and you catch yourself wondering what happened when pirates finally stepped away from the sea, if only for a while? You've seen how rum dulled desire, how bawdy jokes masked it, how companionship softened it. But when a ship anchored in port and the crew spilled ashore, the game changed entirely. The cravings that had been muffled for months erupted with a force that taverns, inns, and brothels could barely contain. A mainstream historical fact, Caribbean port towns like Port Royal in Jamaica, Nassau in the Bahamas, and Tortuga off Hispaniola were infamous hubs of piracy. These towns thrived on the presence of rough, cash-heavy men who often spent their plunder in a matter of days. Tavern keepers, inn owners, and sex workers made fortunes off the waves of pirates who arrived desperate for drink, gambling, and intimacy. For a pirate, landfall was a carnival of temptation, and resisting it was about as likely as convincing a cat not to chase fish. Picture the scene. A pirate ship limps into harbor, sails patched, hull scarred, but holds bursting with loot.
The crew gets its shares, coins clink into rough palms, and within an hour they're storming into the town. Doors swing open, tankards slam onto tables, music blares, and the air is thick with smoke, sweat, and perfume. The hunger for touch, stifled for months, now floods into crowded rooms.
You imagine laughter spilling into the streets, boots stomping, and the blur of dancers weaving among half-drunken men.
Here's a quirky tidbit. Some taverns in Port Royal were said to serve drinks mixed with aphrodisiacs, nutmeg, honey, and even powdered animal parts, claiming to restore vigor to men who'd spent too long at sea. Whether these concoctions worked is doubtful, but pirates bought them eagerly, half believing, half laughing. Imagine ordering a drink that promised you'd be twice the man you were yesterday. The tavern owner's grin would be wider than your purse was heavy. Historians still argue whether the wild debauchery of these towns was exaggerated by moralists eager to paint pirates as sinful monsters. Colonial authorities wrote horrified reports of swarms of harlots and riotous, hellish behavior, but some of those accounts were propaganda to justify cracking down on piracy. Still, archaeological digs in Port Royal have unearthed countless bottles, gambling dice, and personal trinkets, suggesting that life ashore was indeed indulgent. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Not every night was a riot, but enough for to make history remember. For pirates, these encounters ashore were a kind of release valve. Brothels flourished, their doors thrown wide when ships came in. Some pirates paid for an hour, others for days, hoarding their winnings not for treasure chests but for companionship, however fleeting. A few even struck up recurring arrangements with sex workers, treating them as semi-permanent partners during long stays. It wasn't romance in the storybook sense, but it gave pirates something they rarely found at sea: warmth without judgment. Another mainstream fact: venereal disease spread rampantly in these ports, fueling not only pirate misery but also colonial anxieties. Port Royal earned the nickname the Sodom of the New World, not just for its wealth, but for its reputation as a place where bodies were bought, sold, and broken.
Governors tried, sometimes half-heartedly, to regulate brothels, but the flood of coin pirates carried made rules hard to enforce.
Here's another quirky note. Some pirates were said to throw outrageous parties, hiring entire taverns or even whole streets for nights of revelry. One story claims that a pirate captain bought every available woman in a Tortuga brothel for his crew, so none of his men would quarrel over choice. Was it generosity, bravado, or just drunken impulse?
Maybe all three.
You can almost see it. Dozens of pirates spilling into candlelit rooms, laughing louder than the fiddles, determined to drink and love until dawn blurred into sickness. Historians still debate whether pirates sought deeper relationships ashore. Some sources suggest they married local women, blending into communities between voyages. Others argue most pirates avoided ties, knowing their lives were too short and unstable. Did pirates dream of settling with a family? Or did the sea pull them too strongly, making any promise ashore impossible to keep?
The answers vary, as fluid as the tides.
And yet, in the middle of the chaos, you notice small, human moments. A pirate slipping a bracelet onto a woman's wrist before staggering back to his ship. Another keeping a crumpled love letter in his chest pocket, written by someone he only saw twice a year. These fragments of tenderness flicker like lanterns amid the storm. The ports themselves adapted to this cycle. Taverns stocked extra barrels before pirate fleets arrived. Brothels hired more workers, gambling houses braced for coins to fly. It was an economy built on hunger, physical, emotional, and carnal. Every indulgence cost dearly, and pirates often returned to sea penniless, forced to plunder again to repeat the cycle. It's almost comical. The very thing that made them rich, raiding, kept them trapped because their wealth poured back into ports as quickly as it was taken.
Picture it vividly. The music pounding, rum flowing, lovers entwined in shadowed corners.
For a few brief days, a pirate forgets the salt-crusted hammocks, the stink of the bilge, the ache of loneliness. He lives faster, brighter, as though trying to cram months of longing into a single night. And then, just as quickly, the money runs dry, the ship calls, and the hunger begins all over again.
So when you think of pirates dealing with desire, don't forget the parts.
They were more than waypoints, they were crucibles of passion, disease, joy, and regret. The sea may have owned their bodies, but the towns ashore owned their hearts, their wallets, and their fleeting moments of intimacy. And you realize desire didn't vanish at sea. It simply waited, smoldering, until the anchor dropped and the town's lights beckoned.
The night is heavy with the scent of salt and tar, and as you lean on the railing, it dawns on you that for all their swagger, pirates couldn't entirely escape the human ache for permanence. They laughed at danger, they mocked death, but deep down, some of them longed for the same thing you do when the lights go out, a bond that lasted longer than one night. Desire wasn't only about bodies, it was about chasing a feeling of belonging in a life that ripped men away from home.
A mainstream historical fact, many pirates had once been ordinary sailors, farmers, or even soldiers who abandoned land for freedom on the sea.
Some left behind wives, children, or sweethearts.
Others fled debts or punishments, cutting ties with everything familiar. Yet the memories lingered, tucked into scraps of letters, etched into tattoos, or carried in stories told around the firebox at night. Those old attachments shaped how pirates sought out intimacy later, whether in the fleeting embrace of a tavern girl or in the quieter loyalty of a shipmate.
Imagine a pirate pulling out a locket, its tiny hinge creaking as he stares at the face of a woman he hasn't seen in years. Around him, his crewmates gamble, joke, and drink, but for a few minutes he is somewhere else. Home, maybe, or what he remembers of it. The ache of absence is sharper than hunger, and though he'll bury it with rum later, right now it's carved on his face. The desire in that moment is about more than sex. It's about touch, love, the warmth of permanence.
Here's a quirky tidbit. Some pirates actually sent money home, even though you might think them too reckless to bother. Records show letters written by captured pirates asking governors to ensure their share of loot reached wives or mothers. A pirate named Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, was said to have worn fine clothes not only for vanity but to appear worthy of respect to those at home. It's strangely touching. Men branded as criminals still trying to look honorable in the eyes of families they may never see again. Historians still argue whether pirates truly wanted to settle down or whether those stories of longing are romanticized. Some scholars believe pirates craved nothing but freedom, that they scorned marriage and stability. Others argue the opposite, that many pirates dreamed of retiring on land, owning a tavern, or reuniting with loved ones once they had enough treasure. Which is true? Maybe both, depending on the man. But the debate itself shows how complicated pirates were. Not just rogues, but men wrestling with the same contradictions you do. On the decks, companionship often served as a substitute for family. Remember the mateloage you saw earlier? Some partnerships blurred the line between friendship and marriage, giving pirates something resembling permanence. Even without contracts, pirates cared for each other's injuries, watched each other's backs, and sometimes even shared inheritances. A pirate who died in battle might leave his belongings to his closest companion, just as someone on land might leave them to a wife. The sea made them brutal, but it also forced them to care in ways that surprise you. Another mainstream fact, piracy ended badly for most. Capture often meant hanging, sometimes public and humiliating. And yet, even in those final moments, pirates revealed their longing for connection. Court records describe condemned men sending messages to lovers or asking that tokens be returned to women waiting somewhere. One pirate, before being hanged, reportedly said, "Tell her I thought of her to the end." That small plea lingers across centuries, proof that intimacy, even imagined, outlasted gold. Here's another quirky note. Pirates sometimes married ashore, but the marriages didn't always look like the ones you imagine. In some colonies, pirate unions were informal, blessed not by priests but by tavern owners or community elders. A man might call a woman his sea wife, staying with her whenever he docked, then leaving for months at a time. It wasn't stable, but it was a rhythm that gave some pirates a taste of normality. Picture it, a pirate handing over coins, kissing a woman on the forehead, and promising he'll return, even though both know he might not. Historians still debate whether these relationships ashore were genuine affection or transactional convenience. Some women may have cared deeply for their pirate partners, others likely saw them as passing customers. But even the illusion of stability mattered to pirates. For a man who lived by gamble and cannon fire, the idea of someone waiting ashore, real or imagined, offered comfort against the vast loneliness of the sea.
You can see it now, the ship swaying gently, lanterns guttering, men asleep in hammocks. One pirate stares up at the beams, whispering a name into the dark.
Another clutches a trinket, an earring, a ribbon, a coin rubbed smooth from years of worry. These aren't just souvenirs. They're anchors, fragile but vital, tying men adrift back to something human.
And yet you also notice the tragedy. Many pirates never saw the home again.
Their bones sank into the sea or swung from gibbets as warnings to others. The tokens were lost, the whispered names forgotten. But for those men, the longing was real, even if unfulfilled. Desire became memory, and memory became their way of keeping love alive. So when you think of pirates as creatures of lust, remember the softer truth. Beneath the rum and bravado, they craved what everyone does: touch, belonging, permanence. The sea stole much from them, but it couldn't erase the hunger for bonds that outlasted storms. And though history remembers them as wild rogues, for a moment tonight you see them as men leaning over a railing, staring at the horizon, wondering if someone, somewhere, still waits. The sea is calm tonight, almost unnaturally so, as though it knows this is the last stretch of your journey through the tangled knots of pirate desire. The waves are no longer roaring with cannon fire or the chaos of tavern fights. Instead, they lap gently against the hull, whispering the closing truths of how men who lived by risk, violence, and laughter dealt with the most human craving of all. You find yourself standing on the same weather-worn planks, but now your thoughts drift beyond rum and fleeting embraces toward the legacy pirates left behind, the myths, the stories, and the strange way their hunger for connection echoes through time. A mainstream historical fact, pirate legends traveled farther than their ships ever did. Ballads, pamphlets, and woodcuts spread tales of their daring raids, but also their wild excesses. The image of the pirate as a lover, sometimes grotesque, sometimes magnetic, became part of folklore. Writers in London, Amsterdam, and even Boston described them as men consumed by lust. Their lives a warning about what happens when desire runs unchecked. But the reality, as you've seen, was both more ordinary and more tragic. They were just men trying to patch over loneliness in whatever ways they could. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some villages of the Caribbean and West Africa, legends grew that pirates took spirit lovers from the sea. Locals whispered that certain captains called upon sea maidens to bless their ships, offering shells or bits of gold in return. Some claimed the ocean demanded its own kind of intimacy, that those who lived too long at sea inevitably belonged more to the waves than to any person on land. Whether those stories came from the pirates themselves or the fearful imaginations of those who watched them dock, they remind you how myths filled the gaps where facts ran thin. Historians still argue whether pirates truly influenced modern ideas of romance and rebellion, or whether later writers simply painted them with those colors. Some scholars say the very concept of the pirate lover is a 19th century invention, spun by novels and plays that softened the brutality of piracy into something charming. Others insist the seeds of that myth were already alive in the 17th and 18th centuries, planted in the way pirates sought bonds aboard their ships and ashore. In either case, the debate shows how pirate desire continues to ripple into the present, shaping stories long after their bones turn to dust. But now your mind drifts back to the deck itself. You imagine the end of a voyage, the crew dividing loot, some stumbling off to brothels, others dreaming of retiring in a quiet port. A few clutch keepsakes planning to send them home. Some swagger into taverns, boasting of love affairs they'll never have. And yet, beneath the boasting, the same truth beats quietly. Desire shaped every choice, whether in laughter, loyalty, or longing. Another mainstream fact, the pirate codes, the articles each crew swore to uphold, rarely mentioned sex directly, but they did mention fairness, discipline, and the division of goods. By carving order into chaos, those codes tried to keep lust and jealousy from tearing the ship apart. In their own rough way, pirates understood that desire, left unchecked, could be as dangerous as any storm. And yet, the quirky flip side, some pirate codes did slip in rules against bringing women aboard without permission, or warnings about fighting over a lover. It's oddly bureaucratic, like a group of rogue men setting up HR policies for passion. Imagine signing your name to a parchment that says no disputes over sweethearts, or else, even chaos has paperwork. Historians still debate how strictly those rules were enforced. Some argue the articles were little more than showpieces, written for courts after capture. Others believe crews lived by them as sacred law, with punishment swift for anyone who broke the fragile balance. The truth probably wavered, depending on the captain and the crew. But the very fact that sex found its way into those codes shows how deeply it mattered, and how dangerous it could be if left unchecked. As you lean into the rail tonight, the ship beneath you becomes a symbol not just of piracy, but of the human heart at sea. Desire, whether satisfied or denied, drove men to make alliances, to betray them, to dream of futures, to mourn lost presents. And as you trace back over all you've seen, brothels, mateloage, disguises, tavern romances, tokens of longing, you realize the pattern was never about sex alone. It was about the stubborn refusal of the human spirit to live without intimacy, even in the harshest places.
The lanterns dim and you hear the crew greet. Hammocks sway, snores rise and fall like another kind of tide.
One man murmurs in his sleep, clutching a ribbon. Another hums a lullaby his mother once sang. These aren't the sounds of rogues, they're the sounds of men who, for all their blood and thunder, never stopped needing touch, comfort, and the sense of belonging. That is perhaps the greatest irony. Men who tried to escape every chain still carried the heaviest one of all, the need to love and be loved. And so you step back from the railing, the journey complete. You've wandered from tavern to deck, from laughter to longing, from myths to arguments as to rash and lustful, but also as tender and haunted. And in the end, the answer to how they dealt with the lack of sex is both simple and endlessly complex. They patched the hole however they could, with drink, with jokes, with fleeting embraces, with loyal friendships, with memories of home, with myths of sea spirits, with hope that someone, somewhere, remembered them. Now, the pacing slows. The sea softens into a cradle, rocking you with long, gentle swells. The lanterns glow weaker, the air grows cooler, and each sound seems stretched into a lull. You feel the edges of the world blur, as though the horizon itself is folding into sleep. The laughter you heard earlier fades, the whispers grow softer, and soon even the ache of longing feels like nothing more than a story told at dusk. You realize pirates are gone, but the sea still holds their echoes. And maybe that's why you listened tonight, not to learn of plunder and cannon fire, but to touch the reminder that even in chaos, humans yearn for tenderness. That yearning is the lantern that keeps glowing even when storms extinguish everything else. So breathe slow now.
In making the ship drifting without battle, the sails lag the star silver up over. Feel the cool night against your skin, steady and calming.
In this hush, you are safe and the stories can finally settle. Whatever storms wait tomorrow, tonight belongs to rest, to softness, to the quiet knowledge that you, like the pirates, are bound by desire, but also by the comfort of being human.
The sea sighs one last time. The lantern goes out.
And the world slips into silence.